What if the person everyone warned you about was actually trying to save you? In 2018, the suburban neighborhood of Maple Grove, Ohio, still retained the peaceful charm it had for years. The red brick houses with low, arched roofs gave a warm and familiar feeling. The oak trees lining the sidewalks cast cool shadows, their golden leaves falling gently every time the wind blew, blending with the cheerful morning chirps of birds to create a serene atmosphere. However, everything began to change when Daniel Carter, the stranger who had recently moved into the house at the end of the street, arrived. This was a neighborhood where everyone knew each other, and the residents took pride in their closeness and safety. They knew the history of the area, every street, every house. But when Daniel arrived, everything began to shift. Rumors started to spread throughout the neighborhood like an incurable disease. They said Daniel had a dark past, that he had served time in prison for unforgivable crimes. Sophie Miller, 13 years old, was a smart but shy girl. She lived in a small house with her mother, Karen, a night shift nurse, in a home with a white wooden fence that had faded with time. Sophie was a bookworm and had a habit of jotting everything down in a secret notebook she always carried with her. She loved to observe everything and record what she saw, as if this act made her feel safe in her own world. Karen, Sophie's mother, was always wary of any change in the neighborhood. She was concerned for Sophie, especially when she heard the rumors about Daniel. The stories she heard from other mothers in the area only made her worry more for her daughter. Sophie sensed her mother's unease, and though she didn't fully understand the reasons, she felt that something wasn't right. Daniel Carter was the man living in the house at the end of the street, with a small garden featuring bright yellow chrysanthemums and meticulously tended vegetables. He was someone who always maintained a calm exterior, rarely spoke to anyone, and often avoided the curious gazes of the neighbors. With his sad eyes and solitary demeanor, Daniel seemed different from everyone else in the neighborhood. He would often stand alone in the garden, tending to the plants, but never smiled or greeted anyone. Rumors about his past began to spread like wildfire. People said he had been in prison for a crime related to children. These whispers were repeated in every conversation at the supermarket, in homeowners association meetings, and even in the neighborhood WhatsApp groups. Every time he appeared outside, a wave of gossip would rise again. The entire neighborhood was no longer peaceful. The mothers started to look at each other with suspicion, whispering behind each other's backs. The fathers gathered in homeowners' meetings, planning to keep track of Daniel's every move. The children were warned not to go near his house. The whole neighborhood lived in fear. No one dared to engage with Daniel, and everyone avoided his gaze. However, while the entire neighborhood panicked, Sophie felt an irresistible curiosity. She would look out the window every afternoon when she came home, watching Daniel tend to the flowers, sometimes standing silently by the rows of chrysanthemums in the fading sunlight. His gaze didn't resemble that of a predator, but rather that of someone bearing a heavy burden. Sophie wondered, if he was truly dangerous, why did he live so alone one afternoon when Sophie returned from school? Karen caught her staring out the window toward Daniel's house. Karen's voice trembled as she scolded her. "He's dangerous. Sophie, never go near him." Sophie's mother told her about the rumors she had heard, saying that Daniel had been in prison for crimes involving children. But she didn't go into the details. Sophie didn't fully understand what her mother was saying, but she felt the fear in her voice. Mrs. Laura Bennett, the leader of the Homeowners Association, organized safety patrols to monitor Daniel's every move. They tried to keep an eye on him whenever he went outside, but no one dared approach him. All of this only increased the suspicion and hostility toward Daniel. The entire neighborhood lived in an unclear, lingering fear. Sophie began recording details about Daniel in her secret notebook. She noticed that every evening, at 4:30, Daniel would turn on the porch light as she arrived home, and he would turn it off as soon as she was safely inside. This behavior created a conflict in Sophie's mind. Her mother always said Daniel was dangerous, but these actions made her feel like something wasn't right. Sophie couldn't understand why a dangerous person would show such concern for a girl like her. The feeling of both fear and curiosity grew stronger within Sophie. She couldn't deny that Daniel's actions were causing confusion in her mind. The fear from the rumors conflicted with her growing curiosity about the mysterious man, creating a powerful internal struggle. Sophie sensed that something didn't add up in what her mother and the neighborhood were saying about Daniel. One quiet night, Sophie sat by the window, staring at the house at the end of the street. The yellow chrysanthemums in the garden glistened in the sunset. Sophie wondered whether she could continue trusting what her mother said, or if she would choose to trust her instincts. She vaguely felt that Daniel might not be the person everyone thought he was. But did she have the courage to uncover the truth? Sophie felt the tension rising in the neighborhood. She still couldn't forget her mother's gaze when she forbade her to go near Daniel's house. Strangely, part of her felt empathy for this man, while another part was fearful of the rumors she had heard from her mother and other mothers in the neighborhood. But one thing was clear, things weren't as simple as the adults made them seem. One late evening, Sophie had to walk through the dark alley near the convenience store to get home. It wasn't a route she normally took. But today, she decided to cut through it to avoid walking down a longer road. The dim streetlights flickered, casting shadows on the uneven ground. Sophie felt alone in the silent space of the neighborhood. Suddenly, a group of students blocked the end of the alley. Ethan Parker, her classmate and the leader of the group, stood at the head of the alley, arms crossed, his face hardened. "Where are you going?" Sophie Ethan asked, his tone mocking. Sophie tried to step past them, but Ryan and Lucas, two of Ethan's friends, grabbed her. "Looks like the little girl needs to learn a lesson today," Ryan said, waving Sophie's math homework. In an instant, they tore up her math assignment in front of her, then started recording a video, preparing to post it on TikTok. The feeling of violation and humiliation made Sophie panic. Her heart raced as Ethan's words echoed in her mind, but her body froze, unable to move. They pushed her against the wall, tearing her coat. Sophie felt utterly alone, as if all the light in the world had been extinguished. Just as Ethan and his friends were preparing for their next prank, a cold voice rang out from the darkness. "Is there a problem, Daniel Carter?" The man Sophie had seen from a distance stepped out from the shadows under the streetlight. The weak light of the lamp highlighted his figure. Daniel didn't hurry, didn't shout, nor seemed to want to provoke anything. He just stood there, silently, but with undeniable strength. His voice, calm yet sharp, made Ethan and his friends immediately run off, unable to face him. Daniel walked up and gently picked up the books and papers Sophie had dropped. He looked at her intently, his eyes revealing a deep sadness. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice warm but with seriousness. Sophie only nodded, feeling a strange sense of comfort standing before him, a feeling she had never experienced from anyone else in the neighborhood. "Go home. It's getting late," Daniel added, gently advising her. His gaze wasn't harsh or cold like the stories she had heard. It was filled with concern, as if he was accustomed to being misunderstood, used to being left alone in solitude. Sophie looked at him, no longer feeling fear. This feeling was hard to understand, but she felt protected. It contradicted everything her mother and the neighborhood had said about him. Sophie wasn't sure what to do with the mixed thoughts in her head, but she knew she couldn't easily dismiss Daniel's help. Clearly, he was not the person everyone had portrayed him to be. The next day, when Karen found out Sophie had spoken to Daniel, she became furious. A neighbor had seen them talking on the street and reported it to her. Without saying anything further, Karen dragged Sophie to meet Pastor Thomas Reed, whom she trusted to help resolve the issue. Pastor Reed sat across from them, his gaze stern. "You can't trust people like him, Sophie," the pastor said, his voice booming with authority. "Predators are very good at building trust. Don't fall into their trap." Sophie felt a wave of discomfort rise in her as she listened to these words, though she had heard this advice from both her mother and the pastor. Deep down, she felt that the teachings didn't align with what she had witnessed. Daniel wasn't like they described. He wasn't dangerous. He seemed like a man full of sorrow, seeking peace amidst misunderstandings. Her mother forbade Sophie from going outside for a whole week. "You can't keep doing this." "Sophie," her mother said, her face full of worry. But the more she was restricted, the more curious Sophie became. She couldn't shake the feeling that Daniel might be the victim of a huge misunderstanding. During the week of confinement, Sophie couldn't stop thinking about Daniel. She began recording more in her secret notebook. She noticed that Daniel never approached or spoke to children. Every time a ball rolled through his fence, he would bend down and throw it back without stepping outside. Sophie also noticed that he always observed his surroundings with a cautious gaze, as if he feared something she couldn't understand. Sophie's inner struggles grew stronger. She began to understand that if everything the adults had told her was true, why did she feel that Daniel wasn't a bad person? The curiosity gnawed at her, pushing her to uncover the truth, whether her mother forbade her or not. One evening, when Sophie stood by the window, looking toward Daniel's house, she felt a strong internal conflict. She couldn't explain why she felt safe when thinking about him, while everyone else saw him as a threat. Sophie sighed, telling herself that she needed to do something to uncover the truth, even if it meant facing dangers she couldn't foresee. Sophie couldn't stop thinking about what had happened that night. Although her mother had forbidden her from seeing Daniel again, the doubts in Sophie's mind couldn't be extinguished. She began to feel that she couldn't continue living in this fog of uncertainty. There was something very different about Daniel, and Sophie decided she had to uncover the truth. She thought of a way to test her hypothesis that Daniel was truly protecting her, not the dangerous man others claimed him to be. Sophie knew she was facing a big risk, but her curiosity and growing unease urged her to act. She began walking through the dark alley that everyone had warned her about, the one where the kids in the neighborhood often gathered to cause trouble. Sophie knew her mother would be furious if she found out, but in this moment, she felt she had to do something to prove her feelings were right. As Sophie stepped into the alley, the sound of her footsteps echoed sharply on the rough pavement. Suddenly, a familiar figure appeared. Ethan and his group of friends blocked her path. Ethan grinned mockingly, his eyes filled with challenge. "Where are you going?" Sophie Ethan asked, his tone dripping with sarcasm. Looking for a quiet place to cry, Ryan and Lucas stood next to him, holding up some crumpled papers, preparing to do something with them. Sophie felt her heart race. She had thought things couldn't get any worse, but now she realized she was wrong. Ethan and his friends were back, and this time, they weren't just threatening her, they intended to play on her fears. A sense of desperation began to spread through Sophie, but just as Ethan moved closer, a voice interrupted the tense atmosphere from the darkness. "Is there a problem, Daniel Carter?" The man Sophie had seen from a distance stepped out from the shadows, his figure both familiar and commanding. Ethan's group immediately stopped, their faces changing. None of them dared approach Daniel. Ethan, though a notorious bully in the neighborhood, stood silent, unable to react. Daniel moved closer, his gaze calm and unhurried. But there was a strange, unshakable composure about him. "Go home, it's getting late," he said, then turned to Ethan and his friends, his voice cold and firm, like an unassailable command. "Don't put yourself in danger trying to test me. Those boys are not playing around." Sophie couldn't believe what she had just heard. She looked at Daniel, and part of her felt relieved, while another part was confused. How could he know she was watching him? This only deepened her suspicions and curiosity about who Daniel really was. The next day, Sophie decided she needed to know more about Daniel. She stopped by the wooden fence between her house and Daniel's, the place where he often stood every afternoon. Sophie watched him for a moment, then took a deep breath, her heart racing as she mustered the courage to ask, "Why do people say you hurt children?" Daniel stood still for a moment, his gaze fixed on her, silent. After a long pause, he sighed softly, his voice carrying a deep sadness. "I hurt someone, but not in the way they think." Sophie sensed the truth in his voice, but before she could ask more, her mother, Karen, appeared at the window. She rushed outside, pulling Sophie back. "You can't talk to him anymore," Sophie Karen said, her voice frantic and full of worry. She dragged Sophie back into the house, without offering any further explanation. Sophie felt a weight of guilt press down on her. She had just caused more trouble for Daniel, who had done nothing wrong, but had been vilified by the rumors circulating in the neighborhood. She felt like she was facing a truth no one else in the neighborhood dared to acknowledge. But at the same time, she felt more determined than ever to uncover the truth. One evening, when Sophie was sitting in her room, looking out the window, she saw 3 men standing in Daniel's yard. They were shouting insults and cursing, yelling that Daniel was a pervert and threatening to drive him out of the neighborhood. Sophie felt the tension in the air. The screams from Daniel's house made her feel a deep sense of injustice. Daniel stood still, not fighting back. His eyes were blank, exhausted, as if he was used to the hostility. "I understand why you're angry," he said calmly, his voice strangely composed. Sophie slowly stepped back, unwilling to watch anymore, but her heart couldn't stop feeling moved by the scene. She realized that Daniel wasn't the enemy. He was a victim of misunderstanding, and the people around him refused to see the truth. The recent events made Sophie grow up faster, making her stronger. She had begun to dare to stand up and question what she had been told by the adults, even though her mother was still adamant about keeping her away from Daniel. Sophie couldn't stop thinking about him and the truth behind the rumors. She no longer just listened to the advice from her mother or the pastor. She started to listen to her own instincts. Sophie was becoming braver, determined to uncover what was hidden behind the stories about Daniel. The empathy she felt for Daniel grew stronger in her heart, and with every decision she made, she no longer felt the fear she once had. Sophie knew she couldn't continue living in this uncertainty, and she would do whatever it took to find the truth about Daniel. After the events of that night, when Sophie witnessed 3 men attacking Daniel right in front of his house, she couldn't stop thinking about what she had seen. The insults, the hostility Daniel had to endure, all of it made her feel the pain he had carried throughout his life. Unanswered questions kept popping into Sophie's mind, and she couldn't easily dismiss the feeling that something was terribly wrong with what the neighborhood believed about Daniel. One morning, as Sophie was checking the mailbox outside, she discovered a small piece of paper shoved inside. There was no sender's name, just one carefully written line. "Check the news on 10/4/2016, Sophie. The truth is there." At first, Sophie didn't know what to do with this piece of paper. It felt like an opportunity to uncover the truth that everyone had ignored, despite her mother, Karen, forbidding her to interact with Daniel. Sophie's curiosity couldn't be extinguished, and she felt compelled to act. She decided to secretly ride her bike to the public library. It was not just a place for books, but a place where old newspapers were archived, holding information spanning many years. When Sophie entered the library, Emily Carter, the librarian, greeted her with a warm smile. Sophie glanced around to make sure no one was watching, then headed straight to the news desk. Emily helped her access the news archives. Sophie quickly typed in the keyword 10/4/2016 Daniel Carter and found an old article. When the article appeared on the screen, she read every word carefully, growing more and more surprised. The story was about Daniel and an incident involving a basketball coach named James Whitaker, who had been accused of child abuse over several years. The article told how Daniel had repeatedly reported Whitaker's behavior to the police, but each time his reports were ignored due to a lack of evidence. In fact, the police had dismissed Daniel's warnings, which left him feeling increasingly desperate. In a fit of anger and sorrow, Daniel acted out in an extreme way. He attacked Whitaker, severely injuring the coach. Daniel's actions led to him being sentenced to 3 years in prison. However, it was his actions that made 15 of Whitaker's previous victims step forward and share the stories of the abuse they had suffered for years. Their testimonies resulted in Whitaker being sentenced to life in prison, and ultimately, the truth about the depraved coach was revealed. Daniel was not a criminal, but a man fighting to protect children. yet misunderstood by society. When Sophie brought the article home, she couldn't wait any longer. Although her mother was busy, Sophie decided to give the article to Karen. She glanced over it once, then silently read it from start to finish. When she finished, Karen sat motionless, her eyes filled with tears. "Oh my God, we were completely wrong," she murmured. Her voice choked. Those words hit Sophie like a bucket of cold water. She could see the pain in her mother's eyes, and the guilt surged inside her. Karen couldn't believe she had been so quick to judge Daniel, to allow the whole neighborhood to accuse him of crimes he never committed. All these years, she had thought she was protecting Sophie, but now she realized that her ignorance and blind fear had driven Daniel into a terrible situation. The days when she warned Sophie about Daniel had only made him endure unnecessary loneliness and stress. Sophie felt a wave of guilt crash over her. She realized that she, too, had doubted Daniel, even though her instincts had warned her that something was wrong. She felt guilty for allowing her mother and the whole neighborhood to misunderstand him. But at the same time, Sophie felt proud of her instincts. She hadn't given up. She had persistently searched for the truth, and now that truth had been revealed. But, perhaps, the truth was only part of the story. There was still much more to be done. Sophie sensed the change within herself. She had once been a shy girl, fearful of the judgments of the adults, always obeying without daring to ask questions. But now, with the truth revealed, she realized that only courage and patience could bring her closer to justice. Sophie was no longer the frightened little girl who feared the unknown. Now, she was a young woman brave enough to face the difficult things, bold enough to seek the truth, even if it meant confronting hardships and suffering. Karen also began to change. She realized that not everything she heard from others could be trusted. She no longer held on to her former stubbornness, and instead, she became willing to listen and learn from her daughter. The shift in Karen's perspective was not only forgiveness for Daniel, but also forgiveness for herself for having been too quick to judge others. The shock and empathy Sophie felt for Daniel were deeply felt by anyone reading about his story. They could sense the pain he had endured, as well as the remarkable growth Sophie had gone through. This story wasn't just about forgiveness, it was about the courage to face wrongs, to stand up, and to seek the truth, no matter what the cost. Sophie's greatest hope now was that Daniel would receive justice, that the neighborhood would realize their mistake, and make amends. She didn't know what she would do next, but she knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, and she was ready to face it all. After the days of tension and worry about Daniel, Sophie thought her life had finally returned to peace, at least for a while. But once again, she found herself facing a secret that might change everything. One afternoon, when Sophie was accidentally standing by the fence between their houses, Daniel suddenly appeared. His eyes, no longer sad as before, were now filled with alertness. He looked at her for a moment, then softly spoke. "There's something I think you should know, Sophie." Sophie was taken aback, but listened closely. Daniel wasn't someone who easily shared his thoughts, and she knew this must be important. "Dr. Michael Lawson," he began, "is someone I suspect. He's a well-respected child psychologist in the neighborhood, organizing free counseling sessions and after-school clubs for kids, but I've noticed dangerous signs for a long time." Sophie stared at him, feeling a strange tension. "What signs?" she asked. Daniel took a deep breath. "I know he was in contact with James Whitaker while he was in prison. The children who leave the Lawson household often have fearful eyes, and their behavior changes. Something isn't right." Daniel's words sent a chill down Sophie's spine. She thought of Lily, her best friend, who had joined Lawson's club. A sense of unease rose in her chest. "Do you think Lawson is dangerous?" she asked. Daniel nodded. "I can't say for sure, but I think he's doing something very wrong." Sophie couldn't stop thinking about Daniel's words. She was worried for Lily, especially after her best friend had told her just yesterday that she had been invited to a special counseling session by Lawson. This made Sophie even more anxious. Lily wasn't easily influenced, but she always trusted Lawson's advice. This made Sophie worry more than ever. She quickly sought out Daniel to share her thoughts. "Daniel, Lily." Lily was invited to Lawson's special session. "What is he doing?" Sophie asked, her voice tense. Daniel didn't respond immediately. He looked at Sophie with a determined gaze. "I'll act immediately. I won't let anything happen to that girl." Sophie couldn't believe how quickly Daniel was acting. He made no promises, simply doing what he always did, acting quietly but decisively. For the past 2 years, Daniel had been quietly gathering evidence of his suspicions. He had taken photos from a distance, kept a journal of Lawson's behavior, and even recorded calls between Lawson and Whitaker. He didn't want to make the same mistake as before, when there was no concrete evidence. This time, he was determined to build a solid case, one that could expose Lawson without facing the opposition or misunderstanding like before. Sophie knew nothing about Daniel's quiet actions. She just felt an increasing unease as she heard his suspicions. She found herself becoming more and more drawn into a battle she never thought she'd be a part of. One day, Daniel called Sophie to meet him. His face was serious. "I'm done. I've gathered enough evidence," Daniel said decisively. "I'll contact Detective Rachel Hayes right now. The truth will come to light." Sophie sensed the gravity of the situation. She was afraid, but at the same time, She felt a strange sense of relief knowing that things would finally be revealed. Detective Rachel Hayes was someone Daniel trusted, someone who could help him turn the evidence he had gathered into real action. The next morning, the police raided Dr. Lawson's house. They found a hard drive filled with documents, images, and videos proving that Lawson had abused 10 children, including Lily. The truth came to light, and Lawson was arrested immediately. After this event, Sophie felt a heavy responsibility weighing on her. She had helped save Lily from a danger she hadn't realized was so close. Although relieved that the truth had been exposed, Sophie couldn't help but feel heartbroken as she realized that the danger had always been right around her, and she had never noticed it. What she had done for Lily made her feel proud, but it also made her reflect on herself. She realized that life didn't always have easy answers, and sometimes the truth could be very painful. Daniel, the quiet hero, continued to act calmly and patiently. No one in the neighborhood knew what he had done to protect the children, only Sophie truly understood. He never sought recognition or thanks, he simply did what was right. Sophie grew more and more in awe of his resilience and intelligence. The raid on Lawson's house was the most intense moment of the story. Readers would feel the rising tension as they learned that the children, including Lily, had escaped the danger. The excitement of Daniel's secret actions finally being brought to light would keep readers on edge, while also providing a sense of relief when justice was served. This story was not just about courage, but also about the quiet, steadfast actions taken to protect the vulnerable in society. Everything had changed in the Maple Grove neighborhood after the truth about Daniel was revealed. Those who had once treated him like a stranger began to feel regret. Karen, no longer the conservative mother she once was, led the effort to apologize to Daniel. Every day, she brought the article about Daniel to each house in the neighborhood, explaining to them what had really happened. The houses that had once gossiped about Daniel in secret meetings now opened their doors to embrace change. People began to realize that the rumors and irrational prejudices had caused a good man to live in loneliness and suffering. Mrs. Laura Bennett, who had previously vehemently opposed Daniel, now cried uncontrollably when she met him. She knelt before Daniel and said through her sobs, "I made your life a living hell. I'm sorry. We were wrong." These words, though late, showed a powerful change in Mrs. Laura's heart. The entire neighborhood now felt the weight of regret and a desire to make amends. The community decided to host a small gathering to thank Daniel, but he refused all the accolades. He didn't need recognition, only that the children in the neighborhood would be safe, and that was all he ever wanted. "I just want the kids to be safe," Daniel said, his voice calm but filled with strength. His words not only demonstrated his courage but also served as a reminder to everyone about the importance of protecting the most vulnerable in society. The neighborhood slowly grew closer, learning to refrain from hasty judgments, learning to listen and understand each other better. The gatherings were no longer opportunities to gossip about others, but became chances to share real thoughts and feelings. This change, though slow and difficult, proved that people could learn from their mistakes and improve themselves. After the gathering, as everyone returned to their usual routines, Daniel quietly left the neighborhood. He didn't want to stay in a place where people only knew him through rumors. He sold his house and found a new place to start over, where he could live without being judged, where he wouldn't have to face suspicious glances and whispers. Before leaving, Daniel left behind a bicycle key and a letter for Sophie. The letter, though brief, contained profound advice. Keep asking questions. Sophie, the truth is always worth seeking. Sophie stood in Daniel's empty garden, holding the bicycle key he had left. She felt a deep sadness as she looked around the space that had once been a witness to Daniel's quiet but painful days. She cried, not just because he had sacrificed so much to protect the children in the neighborhood without recognition, but also because she realized that Daniel had given her a valuable lesson in courage and patience. He hadn't sought recognition. He had simply done what was right. Lawson's house, after being demolished, was replaced by a small park with benches inscribed with the words, "In memory of courage, the silent protectors." This park was not only a place for people to relax, but also a reminder to all about the silent sacrifice of those who dedicated themselves to others' welfare without expecting anything in return. Sophie often visited this park, sitting on the benches, thinking about Daniel and what he had done for her and for the neighborhood. As time passed, Sophie grew older. When she turned 26, she had become a child protection lawyer. This job was not just a career, but also a deep passion she had developed from everything that had happened in the past. Sophie always remembered Daniel and everything he had done. He was the inspiration that kept her persevering in the pursuit of justice and the search for truth. No matter the difficulties and challenges she faced, one day, while Sophie was working, she received an envelope with no name on it. Inside was an article about a child abuse network that had been dismantled. The article told the story of how a criminal group had been arrested, and there was a small note attached, "Keep fighting, Sophie, a friend." Sophie felt a wave of emotion as she read the words. She smiled, knowing that Daniel was still out there, continuing his mission to help those who needed protection, and that he would forever remain an invisible friend in her heart. Daniel's story was a powerful reminder of courage. Courage is not just about facing the enemy, but also about daring to ask questions, trusting one's instincts, and protecting others. even at great cost. The truth may be hidden by prejudice, but it is always worth seeking. The emotion that readers feel is empathy for Daniel's pain and sacrifice, pride in Sophie's growth, and the hope that goodness, even when overlooked, will always triumph in the end. The unexpected element in the final letter creates a haunting and inspiring feeling for anyone who reads this story.